If you've been in the Nintendo sphere for a while, I'm sure you're familiar with the discourse surrounding Paper Mario, and you'll probably know exactly what this video is about given the context of that, in addition to what Zelda fans have been talking about for several years now. But in case you're not quite sure what I mean, let me explain. The first two Paper Mario games were pretty basic beginner RPGs. Their focus was on story and the battle mechanics, and the people who grew up with those games became pretty fond of them, with their nostalgia strengthening this bond. But after a couple of entries that deviated from the pre-established formula, fans were starting to get annoyed with Nintendo for seemingly scrapping the parts of the game that they liked so much. Indeed, by this point, the focus was more on exploration and funny scenarios. It became less of an RPG, and it now blurred the lines with the action-adventure genre. But because it had been so long since the glory days of the first two games, new fans had since sprouted up who prefer the newer style. This created a rift in the fanbase that still exists to this day. You've essentially got the TTYD fans versus the Color Splash fans. And while Nintendo did remake the Thousand Year Door appealing to the classic fans, it's still unclear where the series will go next. Will they make more TTYD style games or more Color Splash style? Or will it be something new entirely? This debate about which style is better has given Paper Mario the reputation of being the most toxic and obnoxious fanbase within the Nintendo sphere. That is assuming you don't count Pokemon, which is a whole different beast entirely. And the same thing is seemingly happening to Zelda. For decades, the series had been known for its linear story progression, intricately designed dungeons, and its clever use of dungeon items. Take a game like Ocarina of Time, for example. At the beginning of the game, you're limited to only the small Kokiri village. After beating the game's first dungeon, you speak to the Great Deku Tree, who drops an exposition on you. You get the general idea of where to go next, and then you follow that path. You can do some light exploration, but for the most part, a lot of areas are inaccessible because you don't have the tools required to enter. After talking to Princess Zelda, she gives you a letter that grants you permission to enter the next required area. This process largely repeats throughout the game. You enter a new area, get another piece of the story, beat the dungeon, rinse and repeat. There's not much freedom to do things out of order, but the game is still well designed and requires you to solve puzzles and defeat enemies in order to continue. And in this game, once you get a weapon or dungeon item, you can use it for the rest of the game. They're permanent additions to your arsenal. And it's worth noting that there were essentially two different series releasing simultaneously. For the most part, the 3D games released on the home consoles and the 2D games released on the handhelds. But the structures were very similar. The 2D games usually had less of a focus on story and more of a focus on puzzle solving and exploration. The era between 1998 and 2006 is often considered to be the golden age of Zelda. During this time, the home consoles got Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess, and on the handhelds you got the Oracle games and Minish Cap. There were a bunch of other releases too, including multiplayer games and ports. After this, the next mainline console game to release was Skyward Sword. The game was met with relatively low sales and mixed reception. This game represented an extreme end of the Zelda spectrum. The freedom of exploration was diminished greatly, but the story was incredible, and the 2D games also suffered in some ways. Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks both released on the DS and were controversial for abandoning traditional controls and instead focused almost exclusively on the touchscreen to play the game. If there were ever a dark age of Zelda, this would be it. After the reception to these games, Nintendo pivoted their strategy. The 2D games would go back to their roots, and they decided to make a sequel to A Link to the Past, which was commonly said to be the best 2D game in the series. On the other hand, Nintendo would remaster all of their older 3D Zelda games while also creating something new. This next entry in the 3D Zelda series would challenge the conventions of Zelda by going to the opposite end of the spectrum that Skyward Sword did. Instead of focusing on story, the next Zelda game would be all about freedom and exploration. And in 2017, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild would release on Wii U and Nintendo Switch. The game largely ditched the linear story of the previous games, and you could explore the entire land of Hyrule with no restrictions. To accomplish this, the game gives players every ability in the game at the very beginning, and instead of playing through a predetermined path to progress the story, players could now just go to specific locations on the map in any order. Or not. This was completely optional. Immediately after completing the game's starting area, players could go straight to the final boss of the game, skipping everything. It was all up to the discretion of the player. If you don't want to do something, then don't. If you can see it, you can get to it. The game was received extremely well. Sitting at a 97 on Metacritic, it's one of the highest rated games of all time. And it sold better than any other game in the series too. It's currently around 32 million copies sold, which is about 4 times the previous number one, being Twilight Princess. In fact, it sold so well that for a while there were more copies of Breath of the Wild sold than Switch consoles, and that doesn't even count the Wii U version of the game. And given the immense sales of this game, it's no surprise that Nintendo would make a sequel, and so in 2023, Tears of the Kingdom released. This game kept the same formula as Breath of the Wild. In fact, outside of moderate changes to the quality of the dungeons and story, the game is practically the exact same. The structure was completely untouched, and this upset a lot of fans for multiple reasons, so let's get into it. And to be clear, these complaints mostly apply to both games. First of all, let's talk about the story. People have their own opinions on whether or not these stories are good. I personally think they're both good. In fact, I think the opening to Tears of the Kingdom is one of the best openings to any Zelda game. But the quality of the story isn't really the problem, it's the structure. Instead of following a linear story, you gather memories, which are just cutscenes that play when you show up to a specific location. You're shown the order in which they take place, but you can get them out of order, which can be confusing if you make that mistake by accident. But because Nintendo wanted you to be able to experience them in any order, that means these all have to take place in the past. So the player has no active role in the story, you basically just watch stuff that happened a long time ago. And this makes the player feel somewhat disconnected and less engaged. The next problem is the dungeons. They're all the same. The only goal is to press the 5 buttons and fight the boss. I like the idea of the divine beasts, but in practice, it's kind of annoying how repetitive they are. The gimmick of the dungeons are all the same: move part of the dungeon and get to a button. And these hardly even have any enemies in them. And the few that they do have are usually extremely low level. And these dungeons are also very short. On my very first playthrough, without having seen it before, and it being my very first dungeon in the game, Vanaboras took me about 30 minutes to beat. And that's the most difficult and longest dungeon in the game. The dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom aren't much better either. Thematically, they're all much better because they all have unique themes, but it's still the same thing. Press the 5 buttons, fight the boss. I'd say my favorite one in the game was the airship one, but only because it reminded me of a dungeon in Skyward Sword. The next problem with these games are the shrines. It was a cool idea to have these mini dungeons scattered throughout the map, but they're not very interesting. First of all, about 1/3 of them are all just tests of strength, which means you fight one enemy. Another big chunk of them are just blessings, and those you just walk in, get the orb, and leave. Some of the others consist of a few duplicate challenges or basic scenarios. There's only a few that are actually quite good, but the problem is, as soon as it starts getting clever, it's over. And because you're supposed to be able to do these in any order, the difficulty doesn't really increase and they don't build on each other's ideas. The mini-dungeons in the older games were way fewer, but they were actually good, for the most part. And in Tears of the Kingdom, it's the exact same thing. They even called them shrines again. They didn't have to do that, but I feel like they did it just to annoy me. Some of the challenges are a little different, mostly because you have different abilities, and there's more of them, as if they thought the quantity was the problem. Another issue is the enemy variety. You're mostly fighting the same enemies over and over again. The number of different enemies is okay, though it would have been nice if there were more. But my main problem with them is that there's not much exclusivity to where they're found. Maybe if bokoblins were only found in the forest or moblins in the mountains or something like that, but no, they're all found everywhere with only a couple exceptions, and they pretty much all behave the same too. There's little you have to change about your combat strategy when fighting different enemies. And speaking of the combat, the weapons suck. In the older games, you had one sword, and it was reliable. But now, you just gotta pick up whatever you find because everything breaks eventually. Not even the Master Sword is safe. You gotta recharge it or whatever. When does this happen in any of the other games? Oh, sorry guys, I can't fight Ganon. I gotta wait for my sword to recharge. What kind of sense does that make? People say that Tears of the Kingdom fixed that, but I'm not convinced they played the same game I did. That game actually made the problem worse. Now you can fuse weapons, ooh. But because you can do that, Nintendo decided that that would make the weapons too overpowered, so they nerfed every single weapon in the game. This basically means that you have to fuse weapons to even get them to the same level they were in the last game. And they still break! Damn! And you'd think that because Nintendo reused the graphics, sound, map, and engine, that this game would have a pretty quick dev time. After all, Breath of the Wild was the longest game to make, and the majority of the dev time was spent on those things that are being reused. But no, this game actually took even longer. How? Most of the work was already done. This game should have come out 2 or 3 years later, but it took 6? And even when we had the long wait for Breath of the Wild, we got 3 masters of older 3D Zelda games, plus 2 brand new 2D Zeldas and a spin-off. What did we get during the wait for Tears? A remake of a 2D Zelda game, a dumbass non-canon prequel spin-off, and a lazy remaster of the 3D Zelda game that everyone hates? I'm astonished. It's no wonder classic fans don't like this era of Zelda. And after all that, the game we get is no different than the one we played 6 years earlier? Like, what happened? What were they thinking? Well, at least we got Link's Awakening. A remake of the best 2D Zelda is a good sign. It means that at least they won't touch this part of the series. We can't have it tainted by the dumbassery of freedom that trivializes the design of the game. Well, anyway, we got a new Zelda game announced, so let's check it out. Okay, to be serious for one moment, the game does look pretty interesting. The game's main gimmick is the Echo ability, which lets you clone certain objects in the game, sort of like the Cane of Samaria on crack. And it looks like you get it pretty early on, so it's another game with the design philosophy of give you everything at the beginning. My main concern is that the game will have the same problems with dungeon design as the newer 3D games, wherein your abilities make designing a traditional dungeon meaningless because you can just bypass certain challenges with your abilities. The story doesn't seem to have the same problems though, because you actually see stuff happen in the present when Link vanishes at the beginning of the game. But then again, the same thing happened in Tears of the Kingdom too. Another thing that might quell these fears is that there seems to be a limit in terms of how many things you can clone at once, and the game looks like it's going to take place in an expanded version of the Link to the Past map. But this isn't an analysis video for the game, so I'll leave it there. But the concerns of this new approach taking over the 2D games like how Breath of the Wild took over the 3D games is still there. I just hope that this is a one-off thing and they'll go back to normal with the next entry. And don't get me wrong, I am excited for this game, but I don't want it to come at the cost of replacing what's worked for decades. We've seen a pretty sizable group of fans express their distaste for the Breath of the Wild games, and the truth is, it might be too late to stop the rift between the fans. After all, so many people played Breath of the Wild that I think it's fair to say that many of them haven't even played the other games in the series. So there's already a large group of people who only care about the newer games simply by virtue of the fact that those are the only ones they've played. And if Nintendo decides to go back to the old style, it will isolate those fans. So to answer the question, is Zelda the next Paper Mario? Unfortunately, it seems the answer is yes. Well, I guess there's at least one thing we can all agree with. The Adventure of Link needs to be the next remake, baby!